right, we're going to go ahead. This will be our Bush videos. This will be Bush, or W. Bush at least. And I have my regulars PowerPoint behind me to kind of help guide your notes. There's not a whole lot in general for Obama and Bush that you need to be aware of for the AP test, but this is mostly just for EOC purposes. So that's where we're just going to use this basic outline here. Okay, so George W. Bush starts off with controversy with the 2000 election. In that election, the Democrats had selected Vice President Al Gore to run for them. He was the vice president for the past 8 years. And then the Texas Governor George W. Bush, son of the former president, will get the Republican Party nomination. So they both launched good campaigns, and the election night, though it's very, very close, it comes down to a couple states that aren't fully decided by the end of the night. And it's a all night long process where they keep calling states, or it's so close they can't really call a state for the presidents. Well, in the popular vote, Al Gore won. Al Gore had the clear popular vote in America. He had gotten more votes than George Bush did. But the next day after the election night, wake up on Wednesday morning, and the state that's still in contest is Florida. Neither Bush or Gore had enough electoral votes to win without the state of Florida. So whoever won Florida would win the election. So what happens is that there was an automatic recount by machine after the votes were so close. After the automatic recount goes out, it still showed Bush had won, but it was very close, like within 500 votes, which is a lot for a state that has millions of voters. So 500 votes separated Bush and Gore, but Bush had won with the automatic recount. Now, the problem was the machines they used to vote were not great. Like in Louisiana, we have the push-button machines, which are awesome because they're, they're worry-free. There, they had these Chad cards you'd have to puncture for the person you wanted to vote for. So you'd put it in this little table, you punch your holes for who you wanted. Well, sometimes the holes were mispunched or they weren't punched all the way through, and so it was this big confusion. And so Florida had basically said George Bush had won the state, but there was still a contest over what actually had happened because of the Chads, as they were called, were mispunched and so forth. So Al Gore's team had the opportunity to actually ask the government to say, hey, can we manually recount some of the cards? So Gore's team asked for 4 counties that were usually heavily Democrat, they felt like the votes were off with, to be recounted, but by hand this time. So when they start hand counting these Chads, and you can see videos of these people like looking at Chads and the light and stuff like that, that starts to happen. Bush's team will then file a lawsuit against Gore's team to say this is not legal, you can't do this. So this goes to the Supreme Court. So basically at this point, the Supreme Court's going to decide who's the next president it's going to be. So in the Supreme Court, after a few weeks of decision, in December, they'll finally release a statement by December 12th. December 12th, in a 5-4 decision, which is very, pretty much a split decision, they decide that Bush's side wins. This is actually a court case you can see here, Bush v. Gore. But in the decision, they say it violates the 14th Amendment, that basically, you can't give more power to a few counties in a state over others. So because it violates equal protection of the law in the 14th Amendment, it doesn't work. So they side for Bush, and Bush gets the election as a result of this court case in 2000. So Bush thought he was going to pretty much be a mostly domestic programs kind of president. And you can see that reflecting the first 2 things we're going to talk about. The first is the Bush tax cuts. Being a conservative, one of the first things he does is he tries to pass a series of tax cuts, one in 2001 and one in 2003, which we're still affected by. Obama actually had criticized the Bush tax cuts in 2008, but continued them for quite a long time. I think now some of them have phased out, but some of the Bush tax cuts and tax rates we still have. But Obama has kept them in place for the most part since he's been in office. But what they do is they lower the tax rates on businesses and increase the number of deductions for middle-class families. So, basically your tax rates lower, businesses' tax rates go down, people who make so much money have tax rates go down and so forth. It helps the rich out, helps the middle class, it's supposed to help everyone out, but the idea is that it doesn't also help. It could tax the rich more than it does, which could then be used for more government programs, but it doesn't. This is great. It does, at least people think it's going to be great at first. It does lower government revenue too, though. But the problem is that when the Iraq and Afghanistan war start, then you're going to spend a lot of money on those. We're going to spend ourselves deeper into deficit spending. And so it doesn't really have the effect, the desired effect that they wanted it to have, because what ends up happening is that we're going to actually have a cause a greater deficit because of the tax cuts and because of all the war spending we do in the 2000s. The other program that he does domestically is No Child Left Behind. This was Bush's big educational platform. He had campaigned for this in 2000. He wanted to do more to hold accountability for the nation's public schools. And that's what this is supposed to do. The No Child Left Behind program, which actually just ended in December of 2015, or at least the national part did, is supposed to create more accountability for schools. So public schools are now required to have more accountability testing. That's why there's so many tests at the end of the year. So at the end of the year, you have all these tests, and when you have these tests, it's supposed to show how your state is performing and so forth. That's why we have tests on EOCs and ACT and so forth, because of programs like No Child Left Behind. It also requires that teachers be highly qualified, so you have to be certified now. So like for me as a teacher, I have a degree and I have to have my license, which teachers at Zachary High School do. It also gives more flexibility to parents for children who are in failing schools to be able to choose alternate schools instead. But as of 2015 in December, the national components of this are now gone, and so now it's, the responsibility is now put back on the state. So we haven't really seen the effects of this yet, but they've removed a lot of the national concerns. So we're going to see what's going to happen with this in the next couple of years or so. But the national government's now put more responsibility back on states as a result. Okay, then everything changes on September 11th, 2001. And America is taken off guard when this happens. 2 hijacked planes will crash into the World Trade Center Twin Towers in New York City, which you can see a picture of right here. The North Tower was hit first and the South Tower, which within a few hours are both going to collapse. A third plane was hijacked. It crashed into the Pentagon and destroyed part of the Pentagon. And then a fourth plane was hijacked, but the people on board were able to take control briefly and run it into the ground. So it did crash, but it ran into the ground, didn't kill anybody except those in the plane. It crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. After all the attacks, about 3,000 people died. This was more than Pearl Harbor had. So about 3,000 people died in the 4 different plane flights and the attacks in different places. But now America's now focused on this act of terrorism and then trying to resolve this act of terrorism and protect ourselves going forward. Okay, so we're going to see a lot of immediate responses to this. It takes a few weeks to start to figure out who exactly was involved in this. We eventually figure out it's Al-Qaeda that operates in the Middle East, out of Afghanistan and a few other areas. But Bush and Congress now have overwhelming support of the government and the public. People, at this point, Bush is going to get like 90% approval rating for how he responds to 9/11. So one of the first things he does is sign an anti-terrorism bill. He signs an anti-terrorism bill in October of 2001, which allows the federal government to detain foreigners that are suspected of terrorism for 7 days without a crime. That doesn't exist like it did then, but basically, it's that hysteria that after an attack like this, people kind of target certain groups like Muslims and people who look like the Arab or from the Middle East, and they detain them without a warrant or without probable cause, and they may detain them for a week just on suspicion. And that goes on for quite some time when all this initially happened, to try to figure out who are the bad guys and so forth. Because again, they're not wearing uniforms. We don't know who a terrorist is, and that's still the problem even now. He does make a new cabinet department called Department of Homeland Security. So Department of Homeland Security is formed in the wake of 2001 and 2002, and their job is exactly what it sounds like. It's to help protect the homeland. They investigate air travel, boat, train travel, whatever the case is. They investigate phone calls, emails. They try to monitor for acts of terrorism and making sure that America's protected and that we're not being infiltrated and so forth. And it's still around now, but it's a very important department now because of all the information it can have access to. TSA is also formed. TSA is the Transportation Security Administration. It's formed to go along with this improved security. So the most likely place you're going to see TSA is going to be in the airports. Now before 9/11, you could just basically walk through a metal detector and go into the airport, and it wasn't a big of a deal. Now you have to go through these body scanners, and there's a lot more background check type stuff. So TSA is formed as a federal security agency to monitor airport security. It eventually becomes part of Homeland Security as well. So TSA works for Homeland Security now. But that's where you're mostly going to see them. Of course, they're in charge of a lot of transportation security, but you're not really going to see them anywhere else than airports pretty much. They also create the Patriot Act, which has been controversial in recent years because this expands the government's permission to collect information about you and about people in the country without your permission. The Patriot Act gives the government power to do detention of immigrants, to search private property with businesses or homes without consent. Allows them to collect information from your emails or your telephone records or your text messages without your consent. This leads to the FBI searching and monitoring people more. This leads to the NSA researching and monitoring you more. But people see this as a lack of or evasion of privacy. You know, the fact that we've let this happen, and people debate this because it's, you know, if we didn't have this, then you might have a likelihood of terrorism. But at the same time, you're giving up so many rights and so many privacies over this as well, and it still goes on now. I mean, it lapsed for a while, about a year ago, and now it's been reactivated in the past year or so too. So all these are anti-terrorist measures that come immediately after 9/11, and we're still dealing with those today too. The war on terror, of course, begins too. Bush declares a war on terror, and this mostly deals with Afghanistan. And again, we're not going to war with Afghanistan itself or its people. We're going to war with the terrorist network in Afghanistan. So when all this starts in October of 2001, we initially target Afghanistan because that's where Al-Qaeda was located. Excuse me. So Al-Qaeda and the leader of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, who you see right here, they are located in Al-Qaeda in 2001. So we immediately begin to do attacks there in October. We sent a big coalition force into Afghanistan to go attack it. This is referred to as Operation Enduring Freedom. So the mission is called Operation Enduring Freedom. We go in. We also remove the government in Afghanistan that was sympathetic towards Al-Qaeda, called the Taliban. The Taliban was this government that was for a very strict Islamic-type government. They also helped fund terrorist activities. So we removed the Taliban within weeks. We broke down the Al-Qaeda network within a year. So most of the Al-Qaeda network was broken down and not as functional within the next year. Of course, we don't find Osama bin Laden for about 10 years, but Al-Qaeda was heavily disrupted and hit in by 2001 to 2002 by us when we go in Afghanistan. So the results of this is that, you know, by 2004, you have democracy in Afghanistan. We've installed a new government. They have a functioning democratic government there now. But also, in recent years, the war is still going on. People, you know, even though people agree with the war more than Iraq, they still want to see us out of here. So Obama has been trying to get us out of the war. There's been somewhat of a timetable set up, but we're still fighting this war. So soldiers are still being sent to Afghanistan right now to try to secure it and try to get us out of there. But people in general have been much more supportive of this war because of the terrorism attacks than of Iraq, because Iraq is a totally different situation. But that's in general what the war on terror has been like. It's still going on, like I said, and we're still there because of these reasons. The next issue is going to be the war in Iraq. In fact, let me just go ahead and stop the video there.